In a peaceful apartment complex in South Korea, where children played every afternoon and adults strolled leisurely by, an old abandoned cart sat forgotten for years without anyone caring. But on a summer day in 2011, from what seemed like a trivial complaint, a horrific secret hidden inside was exposed, leading to one of the most shocking cases in South Korean criminal history. On July 6, 2011, in the Chojedong district of Danwon-gu, Ansan City, South Korea, life proceeded peacefully in a familiar apartment complex. The playground at the base of the building buzzed with children playing, adults walking past without paying attention to anything unusual. Everything began like any other ordinary day. Then, amid this seemingly peaceful scene, a parent suddenly stopped. Her gaze turned toward an old rusty pushcart abandoned near the playground, an object that had sat motionless there for so long it had almost become part of the landscape. But that day, she felt uneasy. A child had bumped into the cart and been slightly injured, making her worry it could become a potential hazard. With simple reasoning, she immediately reported to the building management, requesting the cart be moved elsewhere. No one suspected that from this small complaint, a horrific crime was about to be brought to light. So what exactly was being hidden? For nearly 3 years, the pushcart had blended into the everyday scenery quietly and suspiciously. It sat there, rusty, nameless, until it became so much a part of the background that no one noticed it anymore. No one knew when it had appeared, and no one bothered to investigate its origins. Until the day that parents spoke up, it remained silently present, like a harmless piece of furniture. Even the building's security team couldn't determine who owned the cart or why it had been left there. But that day, Kim, a security guard, decided to take action. He approached, preparing to clean up everything, having no idea he was about to open the door to a nightmare. While cleaning the pile of items on top of the cart, Kim discovered a large, heavy cooler. Initially, he thought it was just waste or old items that had been forgotten. But when he opened the lid, he froze. Inside were layers of plastic bags stacked on top of each other, soaked with thick black liquid, emitting a terrible smell of death. Violent nausea hit him. That smell was unmistakable, could be nothing other than death. Despite his entire body shaking and being overwhelmed with panic to the point of breathlessness, Kim managed to stay calm. With incredible persistence, he continued removing each layer of sticky, rotting plastic bags. At the bottom layer, hidden beneath all those horrifying wrappings, was a large travel suitcase. He gently pulled the zipper, and then his entire world seemed to collapse before his eyes. Inside the suitcase were human remains, a severely decomposed leg, along with other body parts, crammed tightly into the confined space, wrapped in the smell of death and the cold of the container. The scene exceeded all imagination, beyond what a normal person could endure. What seemed like just harmless waste, lying quietly in the corner of the playground for years, now revealed itself to be the hiding place of a horrific truth, a dismembered human body, buried in indifference and neglect. Around 3:10 p.m., in a state of extreme shock, Kim immediately called the police. Law enforcement quickly arrived at the scene. But even those who had faced many serious cases couldn't hide their astonishment. The suitcase opened wide like a gate to hell, exposing a crime that had gone unnoticed for 3 years. Police quickly proceeded to examine the newly discovered remains, and each gruesome detail was gradually revealed, as if a horrifying picture was slowly taking shape. The body had been decapitated, both thumbs were missing, and the level of decomposition was so severe they couldn't identify it with the naked eye. All they could determine at that time was that the victim was a woman. Clearly, this was not a case that could be solved through conventional investigative methods. Nearly all identifying traces had been almost completely erased. Police understood that only forensic science could pull them out of the fog of this mystery. All the remains were urgently transferred to the National Forensic Science Institute for autopsy. They knew this was the only path to reach the truth. The body found was in such a severe state of decomposition that visual identification was impossible. There were no identification documents, no personal belongings. Even the face was completely disfigured, as if all identifying traces had been erased by time. But science still had a narrow path. a fragile hope amid that dark maze. Among the separated body parts, a few fingers remained relatively intact. The forensic team worked with absolute precision, carefully studying each layer of decomposing skin, trying to extract the remaining fingerprints. And then from 3 incomplete fingerprints, they found a match in the national database. The victim's identity was finally clarified. The victim's real name was never publicly released, but investigative agencies confirmed the victim's surname was Park, born in 1968. She was 44 years old at the time of death, and was not a nameless person as many had mistakenly thought. What made everyone even more horrified was Ms. Park had lived right in that apartment complex, walking through those same hallways, entering the same elevators, passing by neighbors, and for years no one knew she had disappeared forever. Ms. Park suffered from a motor disability in her left arm and was officially registered as a level 4 cerebral palsy patient in the National Disability Classification System. Without stable employment, her life depended entirely on basic social assistance and monthly disability support, meager amounts only sufficient to maintain a minimal standard of living. To many around her, she was like a shadow, a quiet, lonely woman living in isolation in a world completely separated from others. She had very few social relationships, no workplace where someone would notice her absence, and no network of friends or family close enough to detect anything unusual in time. And that very fact made this tragedy even more painful. No one reported her missing, not a single inquiry when she suddenly disappeared from daily life. Even when her apartment became empty for a long time, no one cared or came to knock on her door. Ms. Park had disappeared completely silently, as if she had never existed in this community. According to investigation records, March 31st, 2006, was the last time she appeared, more than 5 years before her remains were discovered in the cart at the playground. During the investigation process, authorities found almost no traces that could clarify what had actually happened. There was no phone call history, no medical records, no reports from friends or relatives, and no clear timeline about when she went missing or died. She disappeared without leaving any sound, as if society had refused to see her existence. In the effort to find the perpetrator, the first suspicion investigators turned to was Ms. Park's ex-husband. As soon as information about the case was announced, he immediately became the focus of suspicion, not only because of his personal relationship with the victim, but also because of the painful marital past she had endured. According to accounts from people who knew Ms. Park, that marriage was a series of days enduring continuous domestic violence. Not just physical beatings, but also mental and financial control that was tyrannical. People said she had lived in fear, isolated and oppressed to the point of suffocation, a type of silent but persistent abuse that many women are often silent victims of. The two officially divorced in May 2005. After completing the procedures, Ms. Park immediately changed her residence address, moving to live in the Seohyun area of Gyeonggi Province, as a way to definitively break with the past. It seemed that after years of endurance, she had finally found an opportunity to completely sever the harmful relationship with her ex-husband. However, when police investigated deeper into the ex-husband's current life, everything became much more complicated. According to reports, he was participating in volunteer activities at a social welfare organization in Gangwon Province, while single-handedly raising their 17-year-old son with autism, the child they had together in their previous marriage. This raised an important question. Could a man who was shouldering the responsibility of caring for his child and participating in volunteer work return after many years to kill his ex-wife? Police began checking more carefully. However, they found no criminal record related to violence, nor any clear evidence showing he had ever threatened or stalked the victim after the divorce. No specific motive, no traces of crime, and no direct evidence made the initial suspicion gradually fall into a dead end. Despite the relationship between the two having been full of cracks, in the eyes of the law, he could not be charged based solely on painful memories of the past. Although many people still didn't completely trust this conclusion, during the official investigation process, there was no physical evidence, no witnesses, and no records from any system that could confirm those suspicions. The second possibility police considered was that the perpetrator could be someone completely unfamiliar, with no connection to Ms. Park in daily life. Not a relative, not a neighbor, not a friend, but possibly a stranger who chose Ms. Park as a target because of her vulnerability. A random criminal act, without clear motive, but still entirely possible, especially in the case of a woman living alone and almost forgotten by society. Haunting questions began to emerge. Was Ms. Park trying to escape from someone? Had she been stalked, threatened, or hunted in secret, but no one noticed the distress signal in time? Or perhaps, during the time she disappeared, she had lived with a stranger, and then everything suddenly spiraled out of control. And then all investigative directions converged on a third possibility, also the most chilling hypothesis. Mr. Chung, 66 years old, who had lived in the apartment complex, was the owner of that pushcart, and also the most suspected perpetrator in the case. Unlike previous hypotheses that only remained at the level of speculation, the connection between him and the victim was clear, real, and full of contradictions. When Chung's past was exposed, the entire case began to shift in a completely different direction, much darker and more horrifying than people had ever imagined. Chung was not an ordinary man. Behind the quiet exterior and pious appearance he displayed lay a bloody past full of sins. Years before, he had been convicted of murder. Not an accident, not unintentional, but a serious homicide case serious enough for the court to sentence him to death. In South Korea, this level of sentence is only for the most brutal crimes, and Chung had once stepped into that boundary. However, during the execution process, he was evaluated as a model prisoner, actively participating in religious services, strictly following regulations, and always showing repentant, humble attitudes. It was precisely this image of a well-reformed prisoner that helped Chung get his sentence reduced and be released. When he stepped out of the prison gates, he appeared as a man reborn. He immersed himself in Christian missionary activities, actively participated in the community, even founded a religious organization specifically for disabled people. He taught the Bible, prayed, shared, became a comforter for the weak and abandoned, people like Ms. Park. In the community's eyes, he became a symbol of redemption and reintegration. Someone who had once gone astray but knew how to turn back, silently contributing to society with all his faith and compassion. Gradually, people began to respect him, calling him a good person. But behind the gentle, pious exterior that Chung carefully constructed, the truth was not as pure as he always claimed. He had told others that he killed his wife in a fit of rage after discovering her adultery, as if that was sufficient reason to justify the act of murder. A half-hearted confession, told like an old story, mixed with some remorse and covered with a religious veneer. But the truth was completely different. According to court records, his actual victim was not his wife, but a secret lover. The motive for murder was never clarified, and the excuse about betrayal in marriage was just a fabricated story to lessen the crime in society's eyes. Not only that, he often claimed to be a dentist, with confidence, politeness, and apparent education. He spoke like someone who had been properly trained in the medical field, creating a sense of safety with the vulnerable people he approached. But when investigated thoroughly, there was no practice license, no degree, no training record existed. Everything was just empty words repeated so many times that others believed them to be true. And then, a suspicious connection between him and Ms. Park began to emerge. At some undetermined time, Chung had put his name down to receive Ms. Park's monthly disability allowance, about $350 under the title of representative. This was extremely unusual. Such an arrangement would normally require legal guardianship or a deep trust relationship clearly established in writing. Yet Chung had neither of these conditions. No power of attorney, no court decision, and no confirmation records. Not stopping there, there were documents recording that Chung had helped Ms. Park move to live in the same apartment complex where he was staying. On paper, this could be understood as a helpful action, but in the current context, it began to take on a completely different color. Was he bringing her close to himself to control her more easily? Or was this help actually the first step of a conspiracy calculated long ago? From a good person in the community's eyes, Chung was gradually emerging as a person full of lies, manipulation, and danger. And very likely, he was the key piece that had been forgotten too long in this horrific case. However, all investigation efforts regarding Chung, who was increasingly becoming the central link in the entire case, were bitterly cut short. When police finally determined his identity, Chung had already passed away. He died of cancer in late 2009, and with that death, perhaps the only opportunity to reveal the entire truth about Ms. Park's fate had also permanently vanished. When the suspect was no longer alive, all possibilities of interrogation, confrontation, or prosecution became impossible. Everything remained speculation and scattered pieces that no one knew if they could be put together to form the truth. Could Chung have been the perpetrator who killed Ms. Park? The answer is entirely possible if Ms. Park's death occurred before he passed away in late 2009. But if she was murdered after that, then there must have been someone else behind it. And that was precisely the biggest gap no one could fill. Unfortunately, autopsy results could not determine the exact time of death. Experts could only give a vague assessment. The body had been decomposing for at least 6 months. Not 1 year, not 5 years, just an estimated time frame, not specific enough to determine whether Ms. Park was killed before or after Chung's death. The absence of that timeline was like a door locked forever, making everything tense. And the location, it didn't make sense because Ms. Park's body wasn't buried deep in the forest or thrown into a river. It was placed in a pushcart in the middle of an apartment complex playground, a space where children played and people passed by every day. So why choose right in the middle of a children's playground, the most crowded and visible place, to hide a dismembered body? Unless someone had calculated very clearly that no one would search. That in a position so familiar and ordinary, no one would bother to question an old pushcart that had been lying there for years. The community's indifference had become the perfect camouflage for the crime. Another factor that made the investigation even more difficult was that the playground area at that time had no surveillance camera system whatsoever. No CCTV recorded who had placed the cart there, when, and how. In today's context, a playground lacking cameras would be almost unthinkable. But back in 2008, installing surveillance systems wasn't a mandatory requirement, and it was precisely these blind spots that created opportunities for someone to silently disappear, leaving no trace behind. Even the timing of the pushcart's appearance, residents living in the apartment complex couldn't agree on. Some residents insisted the cart had been there since 2008, while others remembered it only appearing around 2009. But no one remembered clearly. There was no specific evidence about the exact timeline. Everything was just scattered, faded memories, like how the victim herself had been forgotten for years. And if Chung was indeed the perpetrator, then the most incomprehensible thing was, why did he choose such an easily discoverable place to dispose of the body? Why risk hiding the corpse right in the apartment complex where he was living, where he knew everyone from security guards to neighbors? And most importantly, why use his own pushcart, a familiar item that anyone in the complex could recognize as his just by looking? This wasn't some anonymous trash can in a park, nor a waste container in a public place. It was a personal item, associated with Chung's image in the community. If he really wanted to hide a crime, this was clearly an illogical and extremely risky move. Was it carelessness, an unconscious mistake? Or conversely, was it cold confidence, a frightening belief that because the victim was just a poor, disabled woman with no relatives and no voice, no one would bother to notice if she disappeared? Whatever the answer, the choice of location, the use of his own pushcart, and the fact that the cart sat motionless for years without anyone touching it, all not only spoke of a brutal crime, but also revealed frightening and utterly cold calculation. When Chung passed away, the investigation almost fell into a complete dead end. There were no signs of accomplices, no reliable witnesses, not a single person, from neighbors to those who once knew Ms. Park, could provide clear information about when she went missing or any unusual circumstances during that time. Over time, the case gradually fell into oblivion. No one could answer the final question. Only a dismembered woman remained, hidden in a forgotten pushcart, lying in the middle of a children's playground. And so, What was discovered in July 2011 to this day remains an unsolved mystery. Many television programs, journalists, and investigators have tried to find clues, but all have failed because the main suspect had already died, while the victim was a vulnerable woman whom no one searched for, no one spoke up for, no one protected, no one asked questions. No one wondered why a dismembered body could be hidden in plain sight for years without anyone discovering it. No one realized that a human being had disappeared right before their eyes, while society remained completely unaware. And that is the most heartbreaking part of all. So what do you think really happened to Ms. Park? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching and see you in the next videos.